sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. This week we are joined by Heather Karatz, owner of the Angel City Football Club, now involved with Jewish philanthropy, really a visionary in the sports world and connecting her faith and sports journey. This is where we speak about the intersection of sports and faith, we like to say, not about the box score or the trade deadline, but rather what's in your heart and soul. Joining us this week, Heather Karatz. Heather, it's so great to see you. How are you?
So great to be here, Rabbi. Thanks for having me.
So I know we connected in something that was not sports oriented at first, but then when I heard your journey, it was an obvious connection that you had to join us on the show. So as I like to tell you, as I just told you before, that we start with the ordinary and we go to the sacred. So we'll start with the ordinary, but actually in reading your bio on the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School alumni profile, it seems that they always went hand in hand. And so let's talk about the sports journey. Where did that love of sports come from? And I know perhaps the New York Giants, even though you're from the DMV area.
Yeah, look, it's not that usual where I meet somebody first through Jewish community and Jewish philanthropy or other sort of side projects, and then it somehow pivots and comes into the sports industry. So really fun that we've been able to intersect on this level too, and I'm excited for the conversation today. I went to the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, kindergarten through 12th grade. So I knew nothing different growing up than being in a Jewish day school environment. And, you know, my father, who grew up as an athlete, one of four boys, sports was a huge part of his family's life. When he had a girl as his first kid, he didn't know what else to teach me other than teach me how to throw a football and play lots of sports. So it was ingrained in me from the beginning. And, you know, there was this moment growing up where I thought about myself as this like athlete. I played all sports I could at Charles E. Smith, which gave me such a platform to excel. But I also played club sports and I played on all these other teams outside of my high school environment. And there was definitely a huge piece of me that said, I want to go to a bigger school and a bigger sporting landscape and platform to be exposed to more. But when I look back at it now, I don't think I would have landed in sports and had the success I had across the industry if I hadn't been able to foster sports through Charles E. Smith.
And actually, it says in your profile that you got your first internship while you were at Charles E. Smith. What was that entry into sports on the non-field aspect that allowed you to take the journey into the more executive role?
Well, the school had this great program where you got to graduate early from high school. And so you had your spring semester of senior year free. A lot of kids went to Israel, but the year that I went, it wasn't the best time to travel there. So I stayed back and it still holds true today. I used my network. At the time, there was a parent at the school who worked in the arena where the Wizards played and the Caps played and the Mystics. And he worked on the sponsorship side of the business. And he gave me a chance. He allowed me to come intern for him for that semester. And all of a sudden, having grown up in a family where med school and law school were the only options in life, and I didn't know what else was out there, I was exposed to this sports industry and I was hooked.
I want to ask you about the network piece because we just spoke offline. You spoke to Donna Orender yesterday, and we spoke to Donna Orender 2 days ago. And in her TEDx talk, which is amazing, it's called "Fear Not the Ask." And she said, if you don't ask, as a Jewish mother told her, then you don't get. What's that balance between asking and using that network and really allowing yourself to find those opportunities? Because I find, as in my own network, that often people want to say yes, and they're there to help. So how do you ask in the right way?
You always have to be respectful, but you have to remember that you can't build a relationship based only on asking, right? If you're the person who always shows up and says, I need this, you're going to get bucketed as that email came in from that person who needs something else again. So you have to make sure that you build a foundation that is authentic, that says, I really genuinely care about you or what you do, or, some aspect of that individual's life, so that you can bond through something that's substantive rather than a need that you have. And then you can graduate and say, I need this. So all of a sudden, when you're asking that question, it's coming from a place of authenticity where you're not just like grabbing at something and taking something, but instead you're fostering a relationship through somebody and they're going to actually genuinely want to help you.
And the partnership that you don't know that will come from not necessarily asking, but creating those relationships, I find is the most amazing thing. When I got into this business, if you wish, of sports podcasting within the faith world, I never would have thought 2-3 years later, number one, the people that I've met, but also the differences that we are making. Also, we'll talk a little about later in the post-October 7th world, specifically through the sports world and platform that that people have as well. And so just take us a little through the journey of the sports world, if you wish, climbing the ladder to ownership of teams. And what you said in one interview that you were quoted as, you go from challenge to challenge. How do you find that first challenge and realize that it's not too big, but there are steps to take you through the challenge to lead to success?
Well, I'll back up and give you a little history. There's been a lot of stops along the way, but I'll give you a quick summary. Good or bad, I think I've gotten to wear the hat of sitting on more sides of the sports industry than anybody else. I started as a labor lawyer and used that as my way to break in. I was at the NFL and the NHL doing collective bargaining. And whenever you have to do collective bargaining, it's kind of like your grad school education in sports, because you have to learn every article of the business and every piece of it. From there, I wanted to move to the business side. So I helped actually start an agency where we rolled a bunch of agents together across a variety of sports and connected to a Hollywood studio that was called Relativity Sports. We had 300 plus athletes across the NFL, MLB, and NBA under representation. I mainly served as a lawyer for the company, but also somebody who ran a lot of business development and thought about, how does basketball speak to the music division, or fashion speak to football, or sports content get developed across the platform. And I really loved putting that puzzle together, because this was at a time, when it was just starting for athletes to do more than just show up on the field or the court. And it was really cool to build these micro businesses with a lot of athletes. From there, I joined the management team of LAFC. I got to join that project really early on, again, wearing hybrid legal and business hats across the organization, launching the team, building the stadium, the training facility, retail, commerce, concerts business. We really, did not envision all the success and where MLS would be today, but we knew that we had to think big, and we had an ownership group that was really committed to doing something special. And thankfully the team hit it out of the park. From there, I wanted to go run an organization, and I got a call from Vince McMahon to go help relaunch the XFL 2.0 and help build the league at the league level, and then also run the LA team. So I was the president of the LA Wildcats, the spring football XFL team here. And when COVID hit, we had a lot of success with the XFL, but the business rolled down. I then used COVID, and this is a good lesson for especially a lot of students out there. When you have an opportunity, a chapter in your life where you can take advantage of the network of people who are available, go and do it. So for me, I went to build my network, realized it under-indexed in private equity and venture capital during COVID, and people were sitting at home. And I said, let me go reach out and let's build some connectivity. And, I had over 300 conversations in a few months, because I wanted to make sure that I could leverage that time. It ended up allowing me to be more of an investor, to put my operating experience alongside an investing hat and doing a lot of unique things across the sports and entertainment industry. From there, I joined United Talent Agency, helping the CEO really think about growth and expansion, not only in sports, where they had invested in Clutch, at the Clutch Agency with Rich Paul, but also across the entire business, music, influencers, and the other elements that were there. And, a few years ago, I ended up leaving the company to start my own projects. And it's allowed me to do my own investing, and also to build more sports-related endeavors in private equity. And that's what I'm doing now.
I think we're really disappointed in how little you've done in your short time in this world. I don't know how you find the time to be that, and an amazing mother as well, and just an amazing part of the community. I want to go back to the one thing you said about building a stadium. I'm thinking about that when we'll do the faith thing as well. When you build the Mishkan, when you build the tabernacle, how do you envision what a perhaps sports sanctuary will look like for the fan that, let's call that the parishioner at this time? That they will experience something that will take them, I like to say, to a more sacred level when they're doing these rituals, which I think are very similar to what we do actually in religious life. How do you even start envisioning what that looks like on a blank piece of land?
Yeah, it's a crazy thing to think about because you really get to start with a blank sheet of paper, which for me gets me so excited, right? Some people like fixing things. I really get excited about building something and being able to think really big and then kind of narrowing it in. But the reason I love sports so much is where else in the world will you go somewhere and high five a stranger? Or hug a stranger when something bad happens, right?
I'm
You're
thinking
like,
of so many of those moments right now. When I was at the Syracuse Virginia Tech game in high school, and Donovan McNabb threw a throwback to a tight end, Steve Berminski. Michael Vick was on the other team, and I hugged my neighbor and like, who is this guy? But we're doing it for the love of the game.
exactly, for the love of the game. Like if you saw that same person walking down the sidewalk, you turn your head and go in the other direction, right? But when you're sitting next to each other, you can high five, you can hug, you can be bummed out, you can be happy. And that is what is so magical. So when I think about that stadium experience, there has to be something for everybody. Yes. There has to be. And when you're asking people to pull money out of their pockets to spend their Sunday with you or whatever it is, whatever night of the week, you got to make sure that they're there for a reason. And it can't just be what's happening on the field or the court. It's got to be what they're feeling when they're walking around the facility. When we launched the XFL, one of the things that I remember vividly was sitting in a room and we just had a white sheet of paper and we said, what do we want the game day experience to look like? Mm-hmm. Right? We are asking people to take money out of their pocket for a team they've never heard of to spend their Sunday, and it's not going to be cheap. What do we want here? And I remember sitting there and literally whiteboarding, okay, I have a mother coming with her husband who might love football, with a son who might love football, with a baby who might want to be there, with an abuela who might want to be there, right? And how do you make sure that every person in that family unit is going to show up and feel special and feel like somebody thought about them? And if you can do that, then you can build real stickiness with that fan, and that fan is going to pass that down for generations to come. And that's generational fandom, and that's what we all strive for.
I think we call that L'Adore Vador in our business as well. And how do you then deal with the disappointments or we can say challenges that you didn't expect, that you had this whiteboard and the abuela doesn't come and there are risks involved as well? How do you actively make sure that those are changing in real time?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different, but I can just tell you that I don't know how to function without being honest and true to who I am and authentic. Mm-hmm. And good or bad, I was not born with a poker face. So I have no poker face. Like you can see immediately the emotion of disappointment or success or frustration on my face. So the only way I knew how to deal with it or know how to deal with it is to be honest, right? Mm-hmm. So I would be very open with fans, for example, and say, you know what, we messed that up. That wasn't cool. Or players that thought they were going to have this sort of expectation by being a part of this team and saying, you know what, let me do better next time. And I felt like if I could do that and just be honest about it, that I knew that I had built trust and relationships where people were going to be dedicated and respect the honesty and know that I was going to do my best to fix it in the future.
And so earlier you talked about this cross-pollination between fashion and music and sports. Had you ever thought, or do you think about that cross-pollination of faith and sports? We actually did a night at the LAFC with different faith communities a couple of years ago with the Catholic Church, Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills, and the Hispanic Church, and Keene, Kids Enjoying Exercise Now with special needs. Where is that crossover? As I like to ask my guests, is there faith in the world of sports?
1,000%. Now it manifests for everybody differently, but yes. If sports can bring together diverse multicultural groups of people, right? The high-fiving of the stranger, why can't we also use sports communities to bring together groups that wouldn't normally be hanging out together, right? And that's what the power of sports can do is let's all realize we all came from the same place. We basically have the same beliefs, right? We may show them differently through different traditions, but let's share in those traditions and realize that we all may be LAFC fans or we all may be soccer football fans. And if we can just come together, you're going to feel like that authentic sense of connectivity to somebody who's different from you and realize maybe I'm not that different from that person.
Actually, my favorite part of a game is sometimes watching the players speak to each other on the field, thinking like, how is he speaking to him or her to their opponent? Realizing that it's the love of the game that brings them together on the court. They are obviously extreme competitors, but when that buzzer sounds or the whistle blows and they shake hands, they realize it was a good match and they can actually do something good together. And so you not only built stadiums, but for the XFL, as you said, you built rules. How do you build ideas as well besides just things on paper?
Well, I think when you start a new league, you're given a little bit of grace around testing things. And that's kind of the exciting thing about a new platform. So as an example, sports betting was coming online when we were starting the XFL. And so when we worked with ESPN to think about what the broadcast would look like, we were able to put lines, the odds on the scoreboard on the screen, which you would never see in a more established sport, right? But because that would be a little taboo, especially at the time. And for us, it let us stand out. It let us do something different. You're now seeing a lot of the rules that were developed at the XFL now being used in the NFL. Things about how you could do kickoffs to make it more safe for players so they wouldn't, suffer injuries. And that's why, if you're a big league and you're nervous about other properties coming on board, and this applies to any business, I would think about it instead of how can this other property actually help make my business stronger? Mm-hmm. Right. And so in this case, we had the philosophy of more football is better for everybody. The love of the game is a tenet that we used a lot. It was a marketing campaign we used. But the idea really was, hey, NFL or college football, what we're doing is only going to enhance football fandom. And so therefore, it's going to make the product stronger for everybody.
And so I do have a question based on NIL and the college landscape changing because I'm a huge college fan. Where does that line blur right now? And where do you see this distinction between college athletes and what they're being paid or not, and then their professionalism and amateurism?
Honestly, I've never seen something so blurry in sports in my 20 plus years. It is so the Wild West. Yes. It is a landscape where, executives have sort of done things the same way for a really long time, and they're being asked and tasked with sort of conquering a whole new frontier, which I don't think anyone is prepared for. I don't know how this is going to shake out. I personally believe that we need to do more for these athletes, right? They're bringing a lot of value to these schools, but at the same time, we need to maintain this competitive opportunity in college athletics. And it's going to require change and visionaries who are willing to take some risks. I also hope that we can put together some sort of federal landscape that creates a more level playing field across the country, because every state working independently or every school working independently on this is just going to create more fragmentation.
And so I'm going to go back towards the faith part, because post October 7th, in the totally different world that you and I are living in with our children, thinking about the world that they will grow up in, you've also allocated some of your time to philanthropy and to make the world a better place. Talk about that shift, and if that shift was ever in your mind before October 7th, or if that was a moment that was an aha moment that said, sports is amazing, I'm making a difference there. Now I'm going to take that challenge risk expertise that I have and put it in a different pot.
Yeah, so let me back up for a little bit. I am a granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors who met in Auschwitz. So the minute
today is Yom HaShoah. Also, I want to acknowledge that, and it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. So thank you please keep sharing. Of
course. So my Bubby and Zadie, from the minute I was born, they lost everything. Wow. My grandmother survived with her 2 sisters. My grandfather was the oldest of 11 and the only survivor in his family. Wow. And so for me, the minute I was born, the story of the Holocaust, the story of my family that was murdered, was ingrained in me. Now, I went to a Jewish day school. I lived in a very comfortable suburban network. I got to play sports. I lived what I thought was a normal life. I had felt anti-Semitism at times growing up, but I never, ever, ever imagined that I would have to fight and be vocal and be out there in a way that would ever, in some case, relate to what my grandparents had felt, pre-Holocaust, when anti-Semitism was on the rise. And when October 7th happened, it was really unique because there were all sorts of reactions within my family unit. A lot of people I knew had never felt anti-Semitism and couldn't even digest the emotional pain because they were so in shock by it. For me, I jumped to action. I said, okay, I never thought this was going to happen, but it's so ingrained to me that I have to fight. This is the fight of my lifetime, that I have to stand up and I have to use my platform, my relationships, anything I have, because this is the fight of my lifetime. And this is what my Bubby and Zadie would want me to do. Wow. So I've heard this word called the surge, which right. I think is maybe something that I'm bucketed into, but there was a whole group of folks like myself who felt that same energy and had to jump in. So the first thing that happened for me was I remember going to an Angel City football game. And it was about a week or so after October 7th. And I remember an incident with the fan group on the side, and I was so disappointed by seeing this reaction, this blatant anti-Semitism in the stadium a week after October 7th, that I started to spend more time thinking about what were all the other sports teams doing? What were the reactions on social media? What were they saying? What were they not saying? And I started speaking to a lot of NFL team presidents, other team presidents out there. And there was a lot of folks who wanted to do something, didn't know what to do, were struggling with, how to navigate their fandom. And what I found actually really interesting was this was only shortly after Black Lives Matter. Right. And a lot of teams had implemented a procedure and a process internally where they said, when there is a social issue, we want to make sure that we delegate to a predetermined group of people internally that can discuss that issue and figure out how we should respond or not respond. And so it was fascinating to see a lot of people who were in positions of power who said, well, we built this process and we have this group of people and they've made a decision that we should or should not respond in a particular way. And even though I personally, as leadership, feel differently, I don't want to override them because I built this process. And I had a really hard time grappling with that. I could respect their decision as a leader on that's how they built something. But I said, I can't live with myself if I don't do something. So I started making calls. And one of the things I did was I called the top publication in the sports industry, the Sports Business Journal, and I asked their editor if they were writing anything about the aftermath in October 7th. And he said, honestly, I hadn't thought about it. But if you have something you want to write, go for it. And I wrote an editorial and they published it right away. And there were no questions asked. And I very much respected the publication for publishing it and moving forward. But it reminded me that if you don't ask and you don't put yourself out there, it won't happen because we all live in a bubble. And those individuals were not seeing the same things or feeling the same things I was feeling. And I had to make sure that I raised my hand and I brought it to their attention.
And so have you found any differences that based either on that article or with the Angel City Football Club that those instances perhaps are not happening? Is it education of fans? Is it education of players? Is it education of a league? How do we choose where to put our efforts to make the difference? Not one side or the other, but as you said, we're all coming from the same place and we're all loving the same game.
I love that you said education because to me, that's everything. It's education, 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 which my bubby said the Nazis could take everything, but they could not take your education.
Amen.
So, I think that's really what's missing here. And unfortunately, the bad news about that is that it's not a quick fix, right? It's not something where we can just say, here, this is what you should say on social media, everybody, and just roll that out. Unfortunately, it's going to be a generational long project for all of us to think about how can we better educate the world about what anti-Semitism is, how it manifests, and how we should respond to it.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see athletes, specifically Jewish athletes, but also allies. Obviously, the Final Four happened a couple of weeks ago, and Coach Bruce Pearl, a good friend of mine in this show, really stood on a platform and said, my players allowing me to say this, and he called for the return of Idan Alexander. And I told Donna this the other day about Tracy Wolfson. When I reached out to Tracy Wolfson and I said, thank you for taking the 30 seconds on CBS for acknowledging, she wrote back and said, of course, why wouldn't I? Idan Alexander is from my hometown. And so when you ask these people, like, why are you doing this? It's so personal. And I believe that the education comes from the personal, that our life experiences allow us to tell our players, to tell our colleagues, to tell our neighbors and our friends what that actually will look like. Based on that, what do you see in the next 1 to 3 years in sports that can allow players to use their platforms with the right education to make a difference in this country?
Look, I think everyone has their own causes, right? And that's where, you have to speak authentically for yourself, right? And you have to speak up. So, the one thing you want to make sure is know when you know what you're talking about and know when to ask questions.
Yes.
Right. So where a lot of athletes get caught is they just want to speak very quickly. They live in a younger generation of like rapid response, social media content. And, it's just a tough environment to live in. So be very clear that if you don't know what you're talking about, ask for help, ask for education, ask for resources, because I promise you someone will raise their hand and show up and support whatever you're out there trying to learn more about. I hope that the folks who feel passionately about, Jewish related causes that you and I are talking about today raise their hand. And the examples you gave earlier, like Bruce Pearl, are great ones, because I'm sure he feels passionate. There's 10 things he could have talked about in the world when he had his stage, right? But he's got to fight for the things that he cares about. And I hope that the Jewish leadership that's out there uses their platform and uses their stage to say, you know what, if I don't do it, who will?
And so what you've done also in the empowerment of women's sports, just a few seconds on that. What do you see as what women's sports has given young women today, to allow people like you to, sometimes people when they were our age back in high school said, I don't see a Heather Karatz. When I interviewed Andrea Kramer a couple of years ago, she said, I didn't see an Andrea Kramer to become. But how does a young woman today become the next Heather Karatz?
Well, that's very kind of you to say it that way. But I grew up with a mom who was the only woman in her med school class. So she was very much an example for me, who said, you just go and you do, and you don't think about what gender you are. And I didn't really know any better, to be honest. I just kept going and doing. I quickly realized I was the only woman in the room for many, many years in my career. But the way I handled that was realizing I'm going to use it to my advantage. I'm going to stand out in this room. And because I can stand out, I can add a unique perspective here that no one else can. That definitely came true in the XFL example. There was no other woman in the room or mother in the room who could say, what is it like coming to the game with a stroller, with a baby? How do you make sure that that person has a place to change her child, or some sort of arts and crafts activity to make their child entertained during a 3-hour game? And I realized the value add that women can bring to the sport in a way that, certain individuals who've had other unique experiences can share and bring, unique elements as well. So, make sure that you stand up for yourself, make sure that you add value. I think we're in a different place today. I was at a conference this week for sports leadership. And every year of this conference, there's an event that's hosted by the Wasserman Agency around women in sports. Nice. And every year there are more and more women who show up to this event, because we always created this event to make sure that the women here knew that they weren't the only women in the industry.
Amazing.
And it's become very powerful to now see hundreds of people show up instead of probably the handful that was early on in my career.
Actually, I'm part of the JCA, the Jewish Coaches Association, which became big at the Final Four of the men's, but over the last few years, also the women's Final Four. And I believe this year they had a couple of hundred people in Tampa cheering on the Bruins, Lauren Betts and Carrie Close, our local team here. So I usually ask a piece of wisdom tradition to end the show. But since it is Yom HaShoah and you mentioned your unbelievable story of your grandparents, what is a lesson or two that you learned from your Bubby and Zadie that we can take on this Yom HaShoah in this post-October 7th world? In this world that we all love sports. So I just want to let you know, as you probably know, you probably see more of our congregations at sporting events at your sanctuaries than our sanctuaries sometimes, but they are the same sanctuaries. And so on this Yom HaShoah, what are the lessons that we can take through your journey that you have learned that we can take to tomorrow?
A couple of them. I want to repeat the one I said earlier, because I think this education point is so important. The Nazis could take everything, but they can't take your education, right? So when we think about how do we actually effectuate change here, it's education, right? So we need to make sure that we show up in our friend circles, in our professional circles, in our community circles, and educate and provide the resources and expose folks to what we are feeling, hearing, seeing, because if we don't speak up, no one else will.
Can't say it any better than that. For you, for us, it's, as you said, amazing that we met through Jewish causes, and now our paths have intertwined in this word that I love to use of the intersection of sports and faith. We're so honored this week to have Heather Karatz, owner of the Angel City Football Club, philanthropist, visionary, just an amazing member of our community. And I really look forward to working with you in the coming years to bring sports and faith together on Rabbi on the Sidelines. Heather, it's great to have you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me.